Imagine being trapped on a bus, on an isolated road, with strange passengers and a growing sense that something is about to happen. But what you don't know is that the real journey begins when the bus stops. What happens next will leave you speechless. Are you ready to find out? It was a rainy night, and the sky was covered with dark clouds that seemed to press down against the earth. I was looking forward to my last trip as a bus driver. After years on the road, the thought of finally getting some rest made me feel both relieved and, at the same time, strangely uneasy, as if something was about to happen. I knew I shouldn't dwell on it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this might be my final shift, in a way I hadn't expected. The streets were empty, the rain was pouring relentlessly, and the bus's headlights only illuminated a thin strip of asphalt ahead. The constant sound of water hitting the glass was almost hypnotic. I settled into the driver's seat, more relaxed than usual, but there was still something that bothered me. It wasn't exactly fear, but something deep in my chest that I couldn't explain. I was tired, maybe, or perhaps it was the idea of this being my last trip that put me in this strange state of alert. Then she boarded. There was no one waiting at the bus stop, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, she was there, slowly climbing the steps of the bus. She was a pale woman with a distant, empty look in her eyes. Her eyes were deep, almost lifeless, and I realized she didn't seem to care about the rain or the time. She looked straight at me, without saying a word, and sat in one of the empty seats. I watched her for a few seconds, trying to understand what made me feel so uneasy. Her eyes didn't blink, as though they were fixed on something I couldn't see. The silence between us stretched on for a few minutes until she moved slightly, and then, suddenly, the other passengers began to appear. I knew I had been alone when the woman boarded, but when I looked again, there were more people seated, motionless, as if they had been there since the start. I quickly glanced around, trying to figure out if anyone else had boarded, but when I turned, the streets were empty. I looked in the rearview mirror again, and that's when I noticed that all the passengers had the same eyes. Empty, deep eyes that seemed to be staring right at me. They watched me, but not with curiosity. It was a gaze without life, a gaze that made me tremble inside. Fear began to spread through my body, but I tried to remain calm. Maybe it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. I kept driving, unsure of what to do or say. The woman was still there, silent, staring at nothing. I wanted to ask her what was going on, but something told me not to. Something told me that if I spoke, the answers would be even more terrifying than the silence. When I looked again, the road seemed different. The streets that had once been familiar were now a maze of unknown paths. I didn't recognize anything anymore. What was happening to me? Where was I? Everything seemed out of place. With every kilometer I drove, the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. The bus seemed to be moving erratically, as if it had a life of its own. I looked at the streets, and instead of seeing familiar landmarks, everything seemed to distort as the night went on. Each turn of the road led me to places I had never seen before, and that made me more anxious. I knew something was happening, but I couldn't understand what it was. The bus was full now, but not in a normal way. People were there, but they were different. Their faces were pale, expressionless, and their eyes. Those eyes were identical to the woman who had boarded the bus. Deep, empty eyes that seemed to be staring directly at me, as if they wanted to devour me. I could feel the weight of their gaze on me with every second, and it made me more and more uncomfortable. It was as if I was no longer the driver, but a piece in a game that I didn't understand. The sound of the rain hitting the glass became a constant presence, almost drowning out any other noise. I could hear the water hitting the glass, but I couldn't hear the bus's engines. This wasn't normal. I knew that, and yet, I kept driving, unable to stop. Something was preventing me, as if an invisible force was controlling me, forcing me to keep going. Every time I looked into the rearview mirror, I saw the same faces, the same empty expressions. No one moved. No one made a sound. I tried to ignore it, But the more I tried not to think about it, the stronger the feeling of terror grew inside me. I knew something was about to happen, something I couldn't control, something I couldn't avoid. The woman with the deep eyes stood up from her seat and slowly approached me, her steps heavy and slow. I watched her, my fear growing inside me. She was closer than ever. I wanted to ask her what was happening, but the words died in my throat. She stood next to me, staring at me. Her eyes were like dark pits that pulled me in, as if I were falling into an endless abyss. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice soft and cold like the wind that cut through the night. Those words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I didn't know what they meant. What did she mean by that? Should I stop the bus or keep going? What was happening? But before I could answer or even process her words, she stepped back, returning to her seat at the back of the bus, without saying anything more. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. I knew this journey was irreversible. I didn't know where I was going or what awaited me, but something told me that I shouldn't be here. Something told me that what was happening wasn't just a trip. It was something far darker and more dangerous. And no matter how hard I tried to fight it, I knew there was no escaping it. I was trapped on this road, trapped in the fate of a bus that didn't know where it was going, but surely wasn't heading anywhere I wanted to go. With every second, the road became stranger, more unrecognizable. I tried to focus, but panic began to settle in my chest. What were once familiar streets were now just blurred lines, as if I were driving in a dream, or rather, a nightmare. The sky remained overcast, and the rain never stopped, pounding violently against the bus windows. The droplets moved with an almost supernatural speed, creating patterns that seemed to be dictated by a greater force. I looked at the passengers again. The pale faces and empty eyes were watching me. But this time something was different. They weren't still anymore. They began to move, but in a strange way, as if they were being controlled by an invisible force. Their bodies jerked slightly, but their expressions remained unchanged. I knew that somehow they were watching me, waiting for something. But what? What was happening to all of us? Fear took over me. I was lost, no longer knowing where I was going, and I had no idea how to escape this journey. There were no more landmarks, no more road signs, just a thick fog that seemed to envelop the bus. What had once seemed like a simple trip at the end of my shift was now becoming something much bigger, something beyond my understanding. I wanted to stop, get off the bus, but something told me I couldn't. Something told me that if I stopped, I would never be able to return. That's when I saw the first real change. The woman who had boarded the bus earlier, the one with the deep eyes, was no longer sitting at the back. She was right in front of me, standing, staring at me. Her eyes, now, seemed to glow with an unusual intensity, and I felt as though she knew something I didn't know, something terrible. "You have to understand," she said, her voice now stronger, more urgent. "This is not just a trip. You are trapped here. You and everyone else." I wanted to respond, but the words didn't come out. I looked around and noticed that the other passengers were also looking at her, as if they were waiting for an explanation, but without knowing how to react. They were paralyzed by the same force that was holding me, and reality began to crumble around me. "You can't go back," she continued, her voice almost a whisper, but the sound seemed to cut through the silence like a knife. "We are all here for a reason, and there's no way out. There's no way to leave this place." I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. There was nowhere to go. The road ahead of me seemed endless, without end, and I was trapped, forced to keep going without knowing where I was going or what awaited me. With every turn, with every change in the landscape, the feeling of desperation grew. The bus was on a never-ending road, and with each step I took, I got closer to the abyss, to the unknown. There was no turning back. There was no escape. I was lost, completely lost. Fear had taken over me, but something else was also present, something I couldn't identify. The atmosphere inside the bus had become suffocating. Every breath felt more difficult than the last, and the sound of the rain, which had once been a mere noise, now felt like a roar, as if the storm was about to swallow everything around us. The bus kept moving, but at an increasingly erratic pace, the headlights flickering as though trying to see the impossible. I looked again at the passengers, and they were even more distant. Their eyes, those lifeless eyes, fixed on me, watching me with an intensity that grew more terrifying by the second. The woman with the deep eyes was in front of me now, but something was different about her. She no longer seemed just an empty figure. There was a presence around her, a dark force that surrounded her, emanating from her like a pulsating shadow. "You don't understand, do you?" she said, her voice heavy with a sadness that froze me. "You are here because you have something to face. We all have something to face." I wanted to scream, wanted to ask what she was talking about, but the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed, as if simply speaking was a risk, as if it were part of a bigger trap. Something told me that everything happening, all these people, those empty eyes, wasn't by chance. They were here for a reason, and so was I. Suddenly, an invisible force pulled me forward. The bus's steering wheel slipped from my hands, as if the very road was controlling my movements. The woman took a step toward me, and the tension mounted with each passing second. I tried to look away from her, but her eyes now seemed to pull me in, as though I was being dragged by an invisible current, a force I couldn't understand. "You can't escape," she whispered, and at that moment I knew she was right. There was something about this place that made any attempt to flee impossible. The road seemed endless, and time distorted. I no longer knew how much time had passed since the beginning of the journey, or where I was. The feeling of being in a limbo, a space without time and without end, was overwhelming. The bus suddenly slowed down, and all the passengers moved at once. Their faces, once empty, were now distorted by an expression of agony. It was as if they were all experiencing immense pain, but at the same time, they couldn't move. They were trapped here, just like me. "We're all trapped here," she said, with a grim smile, as if it were the only truth in the universe. "Now, you are part of this never-ending journey." I wanted to understand. I wanted to understand what was happening, how to escape. But the sense that there was no way back crushed me. I was heading towards something bigger, something I couldn't see, but I felt was getting closer fast. Fear paralyzed me, but at the same time, something told me I would have to confront the darkness, face whatever it was, or be consumed by it. The road ahead of me was empty, and the darkness surrounding the bus was so thick that it seemed to swallow everything, as if the entire world had disappeared. The sound of the rain stopped, and an absolute silence took over everything, a heavy, oppressive silence. It was as if time had stopped, and with it, any hope of escape. The bus kept rolling down the road, but not forward. Every movement seemed to be absorbed by the fog, without actually going anywhere. I looked at the passengers once more. They were all motionless, now farther away than ever, with their eyes fixed on me. The woman with the deep eyes was there, standing in front of me, but her presence now was like a shadow, a formless figure. She didn't need to speak anymore. I knew what she was trying to say. I knew that we were all trapped in this place, on this endless road, in a journey without purpose. "You realize it now, don't you?" She finally spoke, her voice weaker, as if losing the energy that once seemed to emanate from her. "You'll never leave. No matter what you do, no matter where you go, we're all doomed to keep moving forward, forever, until the darkness consumes us." I couldn't process what she was saying anymore. The feeling of hopelessness became absolute, as if all my strength had been drained away. I didn't know if I had started dreaming, or if I was living a nightmare that would never end. I looked at the other passengers, but their faces were distorted, as if they were disintegrating. They were merely ghostly figures, prisoners in an endless cycle with no way out. The bus slowed once again. The sound of the tires on the asphalt was now silent, and I knew that the end was near. But what end? What did end even mean in this place? I didn't know anymore if the end of the journey would mean death, or if it was just another part of the endless cycle I was trapped in. There were no more answers, just an overwhelming sense that everything had reached an irreversible point. "This is all there is for you," the woman said, her voice now almost inaudible, but I heard her clearly. "You'll keep going. Forever. Not knowing, never turning back. Just moving forward." Suddenly, the bus came to a complete stop, and the door opened. A cold wind rushed in, and I felt as though I was being pulled outside. I looked at the other passengers, but none of them moved. They were frozen in their torment, trapped in their own bodies. I knew the journey had ended, but it wasn't the end I had expected. There was no going back. I was lost forever, condemned to keep going on an endless road, with no destination, no end. The last thing I heard before being swallowed by the darkness was the sound of the bus doors closing.